that story. Today we have a rather unusual story that begins with the disciples asking a question and continues with Jesus making mud. When Jesus spat in the dirt and made mud, he rubbed it on the eyes of the blind man. He told him to go and wash it off in the pool of Siloam, which is the Hebrew term for sent. In our story, we find compassion, healing, obedience, and witness, all aspects that make up a great story. Oh, and controversy too, because the act of Jesus was done on the Sabbath day. In our story, Jesus comes upon a man who has been blind since birth, and it was not unusual to see persons with various conditions begging for help along the side of the road. People such as these would frequently position themselves in public places, if possible, near the entrance of the temple, hoping that as people passed by, they would give to them so they could survive. What was unusual, however, was that Jesus would stop. As they approached this particular man, the disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The disciples assumed, like most Orthodox Jews of the day, that sin was the primary cause of suffering. Looking for an answer to an age-old long question, they do not see the blind man as one in need of healing, but as an opportunity for a theological discussion. Jesus, in response, made it clear that personal sin of this man or his parents was not the reason for this blindness, but instead, so the power of God could be seen in him. We too struggle with this age-old question of suffering, don't we? Our wording might be slightly different. We might say, "Why did this happen?" Because we can't help it. We seek answers in the details of what, why, when, and where, so we can make sense of the suffering. But be suspicious of anyone who talks too easily about this age-old question of suffering. Well, there's a story taken from an episode of a British movie that was called Whistle in the Wind. It's a group of kids who had experienced the death of their pet kitten. They had prayed that the cat would get well, but instead it had died. They couldn't understand this, so they went in search of the local vicar, or what we would call pastor. They found him in a tea shop enjoying his tea and reading the newspaper. They asked him, "Why did God let our little kitten die?" Well, the good pastor was not delighted to be interrupted about the matter of a deceased cat, but out of duty, he laid his newspaper aside and launched into a long, complex theological response to their question. The children stood and listened intently, and when he finished, he wished them well and went back to his newspaper. The children walked away, somewhat bewildered. One little boy, holding his older sister's hand, looked up at her and said, "He doesn't know, does he?" Jesus was not interested in how the man became blind or settling a debate on suffering, but rather the opportunity to show the power of God by literally bringing light to a man who lived in darkness. Jesus wasn't concerned about whether the man in front of him deserved to be healed or what day of the week it was. Here before Jesus was a man who needed healing right then. So Jesus spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. And when Jesus anoints the man's eyes with the mud, we see the intimacy of his caring touch is at the heart of the healing, both physical and spiritual. It was the touch of love and compassion. He said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." So the man went and washed, and there we find the obedience in the story. And from then on he could see. Opening his eyes, free from the mud, to see the light of the world around him changed this man's life forever. How could he keep quiet? How could he do anything but witness to what had happened to him? The answer is he couldn't. People who saw will see him differently now. Jesus knew he could and would share his story and witness to the glory of God. That mattered. Thus, Jesus' words, so God's works might be revealed in him. Give yourself a moment to ponder this story. Think about the blind man and his parents, the disciples, Jesus and the Pharisees, the onlookers and the neighbors. All are participants in the story of newly found sight. Blind since birth, his entire life, and then the ability to see was given to him. And yet, we see that he too participated in his own miracle story. He allowed Jesus to touch his eyes with the mud. A gentle touch that I'm sure he will never forget. He obediently went to wash in the pool where Jesus sent him to wash. When he returned with eyes that could see, he saw the ground that he sat on day by day. He saw the world around him. He saw for the first time the sun that beat down upon him. He saw the faces of the voices that he heard every day walking by. Imagine him coming back and looking into the face of Jesus, realizing Jesus was the one who had healed him. And if that's not enough, continuing on in the conversation and being asked by Jesus, do you believe in me? And being able to reply face to face, seeing Jesus, Lord, I believe. But the rest of the story isn't as joyful as we would expect. Rather than there being a joyful celebration, rather than reading about the community coming together and celebrating the miracle, the story takes a rather accusatory turn. What has happened sends the Pharisees into a tailspin. Why? Because it happened on the Sabbath. Couldn't Jesus do his work on some other day? Surely not on the Sabbath. And to this we apply our own understanding of the Sabbath and we think, should he have left him blind another day just because it was the Sabbath? Remember, they did not consider Jesus to be Lord over the Sabbath. All they saw was a direct violation to the law they believed in and worked so hard to uphold. And so the investigation begins. And they call the once blind man to come and they ask him how it is that he can see. His testimony was short and direct. He put mud on my eyes, I washed, and now I see. His witness is a beautiful example for us. It's not elaborate, it's just the truth. A witness simply tells what one has experienced. Still not believing, they call his parents, who, because they were afraid, said, well, he's grown, ask him. They were so consumed by wanting to discredit the miracle and the fact that they had considered work on the Sabbath that their minds were overshadowed, missing the importance of the healing and considering only the law. They couldn't join in any kind of celebration for this man and the miracle of his sight. How sad for them to have missed that. How disappointing for Jesus and his ministry. Surely this must have stolen the joy out of the event. Has that ever happened to you? Maybe your miracle wasn't as big as the miracle of receiving your sight, but have you ever had a big miracle happen in your own life, and through the telling of it to others around you, they managed to steal your joy by their reaction? I would imagine it has happened a time or two as you're living out your faith. People love to explain away miracle stories through science or circumstance, and it can be hard to hold on to our excitement, our hope, our joy, and our peace when others around us are ready to doubt at every turn. But that's what makes it so hard to witness in the first place. It's hard to tell of God's work of transformation in our lives when we anticipate doubt or disbelief from others. For this man, maybe it would have been easier if his miracle wasn't quite so public. If he didn't have the responsibility of bringing glory to God through the witness of the miracle. After all, isn't that what Jesus said was the reason for the miracle that day? Had it been any other day or any other road, he could have slipped away and gone home and lived out his newfound sight without having to go through the interrogation or the third degree. But instead, his story was part of Jesus' story. And because of that, he became part of Jesus' controversial ministry too. It was the Pharisees who the community looked to for explanation of the miracle. And rather than celebrate, they began their interrogation. They wanted to discount the miracle and hope that the man's parents would deny the healing. And we notice that the characteristics of unbelief are found all throughout this story. Unbelief caused them to look for evidence, to ask for the story again and again as if more details would help them. They were not content to accept the man's story or the confirmation from his parents. Unbelief caused them to discount the healing and change the focus to be on the law instead. Unbelief took them as far as considering that this man was not even blind in the first place. There never would have been enough evidence to satisfy them. And sadly, even though this man stands up to them and witnesses to what has happened, he's thrown out of the synagogue. Perhaps he might even be the first person we know of to be thrown out of the synagogue because he chose to follow Jesus. And yet Jesus seeks him out afterwards. He follows up with him. And today when we read this miracle story with eyes of faith that are open, believing in the power of Jesus to heal him, we read this miracle story respecting Jesus to know that this healing miracle was necessary. We read this story and we consider that love caused Jesus to stop, not delay, and heal, even though it was the Sabbath. To act in the best interest of this blind man and to reveal himself to him so he could have spiritual sight and witness to others. Do we trust God to act in the best interest in our own lives? Do we consider that the witness that we have to share is important enough in such a way that we can bring glory to God? Do we understand our miracle stories might be met with unbelief? The Pharisees wanted this man to say that Jesus was a sinner because he violated their traditions and threatened their influence. And because of their predetermined opinion, they refused to accept the testimony that the miracle had taken place. The blind man's response of, I do not know if this man is a sinner. What I do know is that I was blind and now I see. The healed man demonstrated more spiritual insight and common sense, calling the religious leaders out on what they knew about Jesus. While the beginning of our story deals with the miracle of physical sight, by the end of it we have the reversal of roles. The blind man who was assumed to be in spiritual darkness could see God's light. But the Pharisees, who could see physically and were thought of as the enlightened ones, were shown to be spiritually blind. This story turned out to be so much more than just the miracle, or refusing to accept the healing. Jesus calls us as his disciples to have eyes and ears that are open so that we can hear and see both the physical and the spiritual needs of those around us. We would be right to ask each other, I can see that you are well, but how are things with your spirit? Just like it would be right for us to pray, Lord, give us eyes to see. As we minister to one another every day and follow the path of love set before us, we rest upon the promises of God and trust in the power of the Holy Spirit to sustain us through our doubts and through our unbelief. We know that our own miracle those stories are not for us alone, but are to be shared as we point the world to see the glory of God. And we too can be healed to be a witness for God's glory. So let's take our healing stories and bring glory to God. Thanks be to God. Amen.